All right, guys, welcome back. This is topic 1.5, Unit 1. Again, we're going to continue with our biogeochemical cycles. You should have already watched or listened to my two videos on the carbon cycle and the water cycle, the hydrologic cycle. I don't think those are too hard to understand. There's some terminology involved, but again, learning those you should be able to do with that video I provided and also looking at the AP videos that I provided as well. Now, today we're going to look at the nitrogen cycle. This is, I think it's the hardest one to learn, um, basically because of the chemistry that's involved in it. I'm going to explain it, I think, in a pretty learnable way. If you kind of watch this video, maybe watch it twice if that's what it takes to learn it. But ultimately, you're going to have to know this. This is the one cycle that, if they do end up asking you an FRQ about it, this is one where I'm telling you, a lot of kids nationally will probably struggle with it just because there's so much involved. But if you can learn this cycle, you'll be ahead. You'll have a heads up on a lot of other kids around the country. So let's get into this, and hopefully we can learn this today. And I think it shouldn't be too bad, but we'll see. Now, nitrogen, like all these other things we've talked about, water and carbon, whatever. Nitrogen is a pretty important abiotic thing. It's found in our atmosphere in great abundance. I want to say like 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen or something. So the atmosphere, up in the air, that's the biggest sink that we have for nitrogen. There's just a ton of it up in the air. Now, nitrogen is needed by living things. All right, it's what we call a macronutrient. That means living things need nitrogen a lot. Like it's not like just like a little tiny bit. Like we need a lot of nitrogen. It's a major component of protein. So when we eat protein, like when we think of protein, we think of like eggs and like meat and like steaks and things like that. A lot of that protein that we eat comes from those things, but they're loaded with nitrogen. So we get plenty of nitrogen just through our diet, but we need it again in large amounts. Now, nitrogen is also what we call a limiting nutrient for plants. What that basically means is that plants need nitrogen to grow. So they will be limited in their growth if they don't have a lot of nitrogen, right? So they get their nitrogen from the soil, but if there's not any nitrogen there, then their growth is going to be extremely limited. So, places where you see a lot of plant growth, most likely there's an abundance of nitrogen available for those plants because, again, it's a limiting nutrient. Now, one of the big problems with nitrogen, and this is kind of why I'm going to explain the cycle to you, is that we have all this nitrogen in our air, but that nitrogen that's up there is not usable by living things. So somehow there has to be a way that all this nitrogen that's in the air can be taken out and used by living things on Earth. And that really is the essence of the entire cycle, is taking all of this unusable nitrogen. And here we have this little molecule here. It's N2. That's a nitrogen molecule. That's all the stuff that's up in the air. You need to be familiar with that. Okay. N2 is atmospheric nitrogen. Now, somehow we've got to get this atmospheric nitrogen down here to all the living things on the planet. Okay. And that's kind of what we're going to discuss in this cycle. So there's a lot going on here. Try to follow along on your diagram. I'm going to kind of break it down step by step for you. Now, ultimately, what has to happen is nitrogen in the atmosphere has to be removed and it has to be converted into a more usable form. Now, what does that is bacteria. In fact, this whole cycle really is completely triggered by bacteria that live in the soil. So we have a special name for these guys. They're called nitrogen fixers. They actually take this nitrogen that's in the air and they fix it or they convert it into something else. Now, what they convert it to is something called ammonia or ammonium. That's an ammonium ion. You might remember that from chemistry class, but it's essentially the same thing. So all air is taken in by little bacteria that live near the roots of plants, and they create this stuff. Okay, so that's whatever. It's a step. We have a special name for this step. If you think about it, I think it kind of makes sense. It's called nitrogen fixation, right? So we're taking nitrogen, we're fixing it, like converting it into something else. And that's being done by bacteria, so it's a biotic process. This is biotic nitrogen fixation. Now, this ammonia still isn't really usable by living things. It's not like, this stuff can now be sucked up by plants and animals and they can be used. So there's a few more steps that are involved. You'll notice here that there's a couple other types of bacteria that live in the soil. Now they do have names. I wouldn't worry about the names, okay? But all you can kind of see that they're doing is they're taking this ammonia, they're taking it a step further. They're breaking it down into something called nitrites, which is NO2 minus. It's an ion. And then those nitrites are being converted into something called nitrates, which is NO3 minus, which is another ion. This process is called nitrification. Now, what I just explained to you, this whole process from getting from N2 up in the atmosphere, going through a step of fixation here, by bacteria, and then a couple more steps of fixing. We call this nitrification, but they're converting a little bit more into this. Now I put a little purple box around this because that means it's important. Okay, nitrates are a usable form of nitrogen by plants and animals. So this whole process is being done so that we can get nitrogen in the soil that can be used by living things. Right? That's super duper important. Now, there's another way that nitrates can be produced. This is more of an abiotic way, but it's just through lightning. When lightning strikes, in the atmosphere, it actually can convert this atmospheric nitrogen directly into nitrates. So, that's another way it could happen. The problem is there's a lot of nitrogen that's needed on this planet for all the living things, and this process here, this abiotic fixation, this isn't nearly enough to provide enough nitrates for everything. So this biotic route is the big one. It's the one that produces the most amount of nitrates that can be used by living things. Now, there's one other way that nitrates can be produced, and that's through just using synthetic fertilizers. We can just take fertilizers and put them directly into the soil, and those fertilizers are mainly produced with ammonium, and that gets converted into nitrates. But essentially, it's just like we're putting nitrates right into the soil. So that's another way that they can be added. But this is more of an anthropogenic way, right? This is a natural process over here. The abiotic is a natural process. The tractor and the putting the fertilizer into the soil is more of an anthropogenic thing. All right, now once these nitrates are produced, then they can be taken in by plants. So plants can absorb them through their roots. And again, remember, nitrogen's a limiting factor for plants. So the more nitrates that are available, the more the plants can grow. That goes not only for land plants, but also for things like algae. Right, the more nitrogen that's in the water, the more algae you're going to get. So the more nitrates that are in the water, the more algae you're going to get. But again, animals can eat plants or they can eat other animals that that eat plants, and that's how we would get our nitrogen, or this rabbit would get its nitrogen. Now, of course, all these plants and animals die. Oh, by the way, we have that process is called assimilation. The word assimilate, means to absorb into your cellular structure. That's how they kind of get all their nitrogen. But anyway, now all these plants and animals eventually are going to die, and they get decomposed. And when they get decomposed, guess what? They get turned back into ammonia, and then this cycle starts again. All that ammonia can be broken down into nitrates, and then the assimilation can happen, and the cycle can continue. So the decomposition is kind of an important process as well. We call that ammonification. That's just the decomposition of dead plants and animals. All right, now the last step, which is kind of important, because remember we took out all this nitrogen out of the atmosphere. Now it has to be put back into the atmosphere. Well, there's one more type of bacteria. They're called denitrifying bacteria, and their job is to take nitrates and convert them back up into atmospheric nitrogen. So that's why the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere always stays the same, because it's being pulled out at the same rate that it's being put back in. All right, there's just a lot of stuff happening in between, okay, that we kind of have to know. All right, so I would suggest maybe stopping the video here and maybe watching this again, or maybe a couple of times, because the next quiz we have, there's going to be several questions about this picture and about the nitrogen cycle. Okay, so make sure we know that. This cycle here, or this slide here, just kind of shows us, or kind of, I guess, breaks down everything into like these individual steps. And again, I kind of wanted to go through this. This kind of goes in order with the diagram that I showed you. Don't worry so much about the names of these bacteria. The on the AP test, they used to hold you responsible for that. I don't think they're going to do that anymore. So I wouldn't worry so much about it. Just understand that, for example, biotic nitrogen fixation, right? That is done by bacteria. All right, they have a name, don't worry about that, but this is what they're doing. They're taking atmospheric nitrogen and they're converting it into ammonia. That's what they do. We need to recognize these formulas. All right, if you don't know what N2 is, if you don't know what it is, then you can't describe the nitrogen cycle correctly. If you don't know what NH3 or NH4 plus is, then it's going to be hard to explain it. Okay. Nitrification, that's where the ammonia gets broken down eventually into nitrates. That is a two-step process, right? So it kind of breaks down into nitrite first and then into nitrate, right? But again, that's a process. Abiotic nitrogen fixation, that's done by lightning. Assimilation, that's the uptake of nitrates by plants and animals. Ammonification is the decay or the decomposition back into ammonia. And then we have denitrification, where all those nitrates go back up into the atmosphere. All right, so that's kind of the last step. So I would use this slide, with this diagram, because they're essentially kind of both the same thing. All right, so knowing that is going to be kind of an important thing. All right, I'm going to stop the video. Actually, I'm going to go on one more slide here. These plants that I was talking about earlier in the first step of nitrogen fixation, these are called legumes. Legumes are basically plants that have a high amount of soil bacteria near their roots. And they're found in these little things called root nodules, which is what you're seeing in this little picture here. These are some examples of some legume plants, things like soybeans and alfalfa and these types of things. These are loaded with those soil bacteria that will help convert nitrogen into ammonia and then eventually into nitrate. So these are plants that farmers love because they kind of naturally produce a lot of nitrogen for their crops. All right, so I'll leave it up there for today. There's going to be another video that follows this one that kind of explains some of the impacts that humans are having on the nitrogen cycle. So watch that one after this one's over. All right, guys, thanks for sticking along with me there.